Hi there, welcome back to another episode of Sit and Spin with me, your host, Joe Royland. Today on the show, very excited to be talking about the return of one of my favorite bands, that being Stone Temple Pilots with their new self-titled album. It's the band's 7th studio album, their second to be titled Stone Temple Pilots, and their first full-length album in 8 years, also their first record following the deaths of original singer Scott Weiland and his replacement Chester Bennington. Now, this one might get a little lengthy, but there's a lot of points to go over. So just strap in and bear with me and enjoy the great tunes going on in the background. Now, one of the things that made Stone Temple Pilots one of my favorite bands, they debuted in the early 90s decade. At the same time, grunge music was becoming popular, which kind of erroneously oftentimes gets them lumped in with that scene, even though they're not from the Pacific Northwest. But Stone Temple Pilots quickly proved they had a lot more going on than your average grunge band, as they would incorporate all these different sounds into their style, including such elements as funk, jazz, country, lounge, samba, bossa nova, and all these other elements among them, to creating this really full sound going on. They featured the vocal stylings of charismatic singer Scott Weiland, the melodic bass work and keyboard playing of Robert DeLeo, and his talents in crafting great hooks and memorable songs. He wrote most of the band's output, the main songwriter at least, and his older brother Dean DeLeo on guitar, who in my humble opinion is one of the most underrated and my favorite players to come out of the last 20 plus years. He was always adept at creating these different styles of guitar playing with inventive riffs and solos that use different tones and different stylings, and just a really well-rounded player. And rounding out the group was the ever-solid drum work of Eric Kretz, who is just as skilled at pounding out stick work as he is at shooting subtle brush stylings and different things along the way, and also played a lot of keyboards on the band's catalog, which you may not have known. Now, the only hitch in all of this was, as great a talent as Scott Weiland was, and love him, miss him dearly, he was also his own worst enemy in being extremely self-destructive and never seeming to be able to escape his substance addictions and run-ins with the law, which nearly sidelined the band just as they were becoming really popular, and sadly resulted in the end of his own life in December 2015 from an accidental overdose. So what do you do when you're a successful band and you have to replace your iconic frontman? And Scott Weiland was definitely one of the most iconic frontmen to ever be in rock music, or even another member of your band for that group. Well, it's a tale that's been told many times in rock, and essentially there's really only a couple of options you can pursue. One, you can go the AC/DC route and bringing in a relatively unknown person, as they did with Brian Johnson. And I know what you're saying. Yes, Brian Johnson was in Grody, but unless you lived in the UK, you didn't know who Grody was. He was, for the most intents and purposes, he was relatively unknown. And you want to hope that you can still capture the essence of the sound of your previous singer so that you can do your previous material justice, but also bring in some new creative energy for future releases. And in the case of AC/DC, they ended up having some of their most successful records ever with Brian Johnson, Back in Black leading them all off. You can also go the Van Halen route of taking an already established artist and hoping that not only do you get that new ideas and energy and excitement, but you also bring along some of that person's audience with them well to help build your audience. Now, neither one is foolproof. In the case of Van Halen, they also had some of their greatest commercial success after they lost David Lee Roth and brought Sammy Hagar in. But you also bring in all that person's baggage along with them, as well as the baggage of their fans. You will have a degree of that person's audience who does not like the pairing, as well as your own audience who may not be particularly fond of the pairing. So either way, it's not exactly a guaranteed success. Now, as for STP, what they did, or at least the members of the DeLeo brothers and Eric Kretz, is they kind of tested the waters with both styles initially. First with the side project Talk Show in 1997, when the group were on their first break, while singer Scott Weiland was also pursuing a solo career, getting ready to release his debut album 12 Bar Blues in 1998. Now, neither one of these projects, while I enjoyed both of them, turned out to be really popular with the masses, and as such, had either one of them gone really well, STP could have fired Scott Weiland then and then just brought in Dave Coots as their new lead singer, Dave Coots being the former singer for 10 Inch Men for Talk Show. Or Scott Weiland's solo album could have really taken off and he could have just decided to go solo. One way or another, though, STP was still going to continue on in some form because they still owed Atlantic Records a couple of albums. But it ended up working out that the public just seemed to like that combination that those four people brought together in a magical unit. So STP regrouped and came out with another record. But unfortunately, their career trajectory never quite recovered from that break. And even though they released 2 more albums to dwindling returns, tensions in the band would eventually resurface again, leading to another break in the early 2000s. This time out, Scott Weiland would join up with former members of Guns N' Roses Slash, Stuff McKagan, and Matt Sorum to form the supergroup Velvet Revolver. And the DeLeo brothers would form their own little mini supergroup with Army of Anyone, with former frontman from Filter, or former Filter, I shouldn't say former, he's still the frontman Filter, but with Filter frontman Richard Patrick and future Korn drummer Ray Lauser. Now, while Velvet Revolver's debut Contraband was successful, its follow-up album Libertad tanked in comparison, and Army of Anyone pretty much went on an indefinite hiatus after they released their self-titled album and didn't tour behind it, so they kind of shared a similar fate. They didn't really go anywhere after that. And even then, Velvet Revolver's success, I think initial success, owed as much to the involvement of the Guns N' Roses members, maybe even more so than it did Scott Weiland's involvement. So around this time, Scott goes solo again. He sets about making a second solo album, Happy in Galoshes, and somewhere in the interim of that, he reconciles with the DeLeo brothers, and they get together and start talking about let's make some new music again. And they finally do put out a new record, self-titled album in 2010, that even though it reached number 2 on the charts, a lot of people thought was kind of lackluster. And within a couple of years of touring behind that album, what do you think happened? Tensions arose once again, brought on by mainly Scott's drug issues and his failing to perform well at shows and stuff. And finally, the DeLeos and Kretz said, you know what? We had enough. We've given this guy all the chances in the world, but we need to continue in a positive way to keep creating music. And they fired Scott, left him out of the band. This went to Scott going off and forming his own band, Scott Weiland and the Wildabout. He went to work on his 3rd solo record. Also released a Christmas album in that interim. But the remaining members of STT then went the second route of the bringing in a known quantity and got Chester Bennington of Linkin Park to be the new frontman for their band. And although the chemistry between those guys proved to be pretty favorable, they all got along really well and stuff, it turned out to be kind of a short-lived pairing. Only a couple of years before Chester would go back to focusing on being in Linkin Park. And the only recorded output that happened from this band, other than like the live shows that did really well, was the High Rise EP in 2013, which was also not exactly the group's best work. I barely revisited that EP since it came out back then. 5 years between now and then. I've hardly listened to it at all. And sadly, in 2017, Chester would take his own life, and with the death of Scott Weiland and then his death, this kind of left like no possible reconciliations for a future of STP with either of those singers. And in 2016, the band set about finding another new lead singer by holding an open audition process through their website. Not necessarily the most promising idea, you know, from a music fan's point of view. So I was kind of hesitant as like, how's this going to turn out? Well, in November of last year, following the reissue in a box set deluxe form remastered version of the band's debut album Core, the group finally announced that they'd settled on a new lead singer in Jeff Gutt, a former X Factor runner-up, and they released the single Meadow, which was going to be the introductory tune off of their upcoming album due out in early 2018. Now, whenever somebody's involved in a reality show, that automatically kind of brings their credibility down. You know, it's not right. There's no real good reason for it, but there's just puts a negative connotation on them. So I was initially a little skeptical at how this would all turn out, but being a longtime fan of the band, I decided to give them the benefit of the doubt. And in truth, I didn't really listen to Meadow. I kind of started listening to it just a little bit and decided, nope, that's enough. I want to wait till the whole album comes out before I can pass my judgment on it. And I just want to hear the whole thing in its own setting. But while I have hopes, you know, that maybe this would turn out to be a good thing, if time has taught me anything, it's that the past doesn't necessarily favor what Stone Temple Pilots sounded like without Scott Weiland. So that's a big hump they had to get over. And now that we're at the point where I can finally hear the whole album, and having done so for the past week or so since its release, I can say that I'm pleasantly impressed with the results. Everything I would want out of a Stone Temple Pilots album, minus Scott Weiland. You can't have him, that's neither here nor there. It's a great mix of solid tunes and varying styles, outstanding playing from all the group's members, particularly Dean DeLeo, who contributes killer solos to just about every song on this album. If there's an MVV for this record, it's probably him, closely followed up by Robert DeLeo for always turning out great songwriting. And yes, Jeff Gutt does an impressive job filling some mighty big shoes in a rather unenviable position that he's in. Oftentimes, he sounds so uncannily like the late Scott Weiland that if you didn't know better, you could be forgiven for thinking that maybe some of these songs were previously unheard songs from Scott Weiland's tenure with the band. But I can say that while he doesn't possess necessarily the same vocal dynamic range that Scott Weiland had, he still gets the job done rather admirably and can, like I said, just sometimes sound eerily like him. And also, he may not possess the same poetic lyric writing skills that Scott Weiland does, but on the opposite side of that, that could lead some people to think that maybe these lyrics are a little safe. But again, on the opposite side of that, there's also a whole hell of a lot less references to drugs and metaphors for drugs that were often a big part of Scott Weiland's writing style. Know right what you know is what they always say. Well, that's what Scott would often do. Now, the band also does a really respectable job of crafting songs that represent the various aspects of their previous catalog, while also adding a little bit of fresh stuff to this mix too. So let's go song by song through the album. You've already heard a few of the tracks. We're up to track 4 on the album right now. Middle of the Road opens the album, the charging rocker featuring driving Jimmy Page Lep-style guitar riff from Dean DeLeo, and Gutt, as I said, sounding very reminiscent of late Scott Weiland, the vocal delivery. Guilty shifts the gears back up a notch, this time just another strong tune with a rocking department and some cool overdriven bass from Robert DeLeo in part of its breakdown. Meadow follows, and I can see why it was chosen as the album's first single. It rides a catchy riff that captures the group's classic sound while, like I said previously, adding in modern approach to the delivery. It's a cool first taste of what Jeff Gutt was going to offer to the band. Just a Little Lie, which is what you're hearing right now, drops the pace down to a more plodding, hypnotic groove propelled by STP's rhythm section of Robert DeLeo and Eric Kretz. There is one title guitar riff that's recycled. If it comes up again, I'll point it out to you, that I hear that's right out of Tripping on a Hole in a Paper Heart from Tiny Music, but otherwise this psychedelic offering has not much in common with that tune, and I really like it anyway. 6/8 continues the rocking sound with a touch of Henny Stover rock groove in its intro and chorus sections, and features some nice shifting vocal and multi-layer tracking work from Jeff Gutt and a sweet slide solo from Dean. Thought She'd Be Mine switches up the album sound with a more acoustic delivery and is one of the album's highlights for me. In a perfect world, this song should be a massive hit. Kind of a touch of a mix between I Got You and a sunnier version of Sour Girl from the band's number 4 album. That's kind of the musical approach to this one. Lots of cool stuff musically going on in the background. Some of those dispersant elements I mentioned earlier, you'll hear a lot of those things. I like how the main guitar riff of the song is faded out, being played on vibes instead of guitar, although there's a touch of guitar under it too. It's a really nice touch. Roll Me Under comes in next, returning us to the heavier sounding groove of the album. And it's the album's second single, and again, I can kind of see why they picked this tune, because it's got a real classic SCP feel. Never Enough is up next with a very gorgeous vibe, a la Texas Radio and the big beat and its kind of stomp in its intro and verse sections, and even a very Robbie Krieger-inspired guitar solo from Dean DeLeo. What's interesting is Scott was heavily influenced by the late Jim Morrison, and so here you've got Jeff Gutt channeling Scott Weiland, channeling Jim Morrison, but it works out really well, so I can't deny the song at all for that part. From there, the album takes a turn back to a more mellow vibe with the next 2 tracks, which are both standout songs for me. Love both of these, and as previously mentioned, these 2 songs also have those aspects I really appreciate from Stone Temple Pilots' career. When I go back and think of songs like And So I Know and Wonderful and things like that. Those are some of my favorite Stone Temple Pilots songs, and that influence is heard on these next 2 tracks. The first up is a beautiful ballad, The Art of Letting Go. And again, this is another song that in my book deserves to be a big hit. It reminds me of those tracks I talked about, and features some impassioned singing from Jeff Gutt, especially in the chorus sections where he really gets to shine, and a beautiful jazzy muted solo from Dean DeLeo. Finest Hour follows, bringing the pace act just a notch, but still riding in a more melancholy vein, and I love it just as much. Its lyrics sound like they could be an homage equally to both Scott Weiland and Chester Bennington, and even if it's not about them, it serves as a fitting epitaph, a fitting tribute to both of those guys, or an epitaph to them, to an album that's dedicated to both previous singers, I should mention as well. Good Shoes momentarily brings us back to the upbeat rockin' with a cool riff and an old school 70s vibe. It shows off the band's influences from groups like Led Zeppelin again, and Aerosmith, and again, some shit hot guitar with Dean DeLeo on the song throughout it, and the solos as well. Reds and Blues closes out the album proper with a slide back to a more acoustic, slow tempo, combining countrified elements of Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, with a little touch of later period Beatles psychedelia. It's a nice capper to a solid return to form for STP. Now, I say album proper because there is a deluxe exclusive to Best Buy version of the album, which of course is the version I bought, that adds 2 extra songs to the track, the album's run order. First up is the song Already Gone, which is another super catchy, upbeat, single-worthy track that I'm surprised didn't make the album proper. It's that good, but maybe they just didn't want 13 tracks on the album, who knows. And then the last song, Forget Forever, which is also a decent cut, but at least with this one I can see why it didn't make the record proper, because it's probably the least sounding STP song out of all these sessions, and the chorus is a little bit generic in the chorus part, but overall, confident album that I hope gets the audience it deserves, and left me pretty satisfied, wanting more. I'm interested to hear where Stone Temple Pilots goes from here with Jeff Gutt, how much more he's going to bring to the band. I would very much like to see this version of the band live. If they come around here, I'm going to go see them. But otherwise, got this awesome album in the meantime. Now, there is a vinyl version of this record coming out, but you're going to have to wait to the end of May for it to get released. I'm definitely going to be picking it up on vinyl as well, because I dig this album so much. I hope that the 2 bonus tracks make it onto the vinyl version of the album, because I think it still only clocks in at about 48 minutes, even with the inclusion of those. But go out and pick this one up. Hopefully you can get over the fact that Scott Weiland isn't a part of it. I did, and I'm really happy with this record. Hopefully you will be too. Stone Temple Pilots' new self-titled album out now. Go out and pick it up. And that's the show for this week. Thanks for tuning in. Hopefully we'll have something else groovy and new for you sooner rather than later. Record Store Day is coming up in about a month. Can't wait for that. And one last thing to shout out again for the Rockin' Pod Expo 2. Even if you can't go, please go and contribute some money to the GoFundMe. I'll put up the link for that again. Even if it's like $10, $10 will get you into the door if you decide to go. It'll also get you some other exclusive perks that are going to be coming up from the various podcasters. So please, if you can, chip in what you can to the Rockin' Pod Expo 2 so that I can go as well. And we will catch you next time on Sit and Spin. Thanks once again. We'll talk to you then.